Russia's incursion into eastern Ukraine triggers a wave of sanctions from the US and Europe. The West wields economic measures aimed at punishing President Putin, but can they actually be effective? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the strategy of sanctions against Russia. Ukraine has imposed a state of emergency, urged its civilians to leave Russia, and has begun conscripting fighting-age reservists for the army. Europe's worst crisis in decades reached new heights after Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine as independent. Putin insists he is still open to a diplomatic solution, but has made it clear he won't budge on the safety of Russian civilians there and ordered alleged peacekeeping troops be sent in. The international response so far seems to consist almost entirely of sanctions. These days, punitive economic measures seem to be the Western world's weapon of choice. But are they the best tools to dissuade Russia from pursuing what many diplomats say would be an all-out war? That is our conversation for today. But first, let's take a look at what Russia has been hit with.
We're implementing full blocking sanctions on two large Russian financial institutions, VEB and their military bank. We're implementing comprehensive sanctions on Russian sovereign debt. That means we've cut off Russia's government from Western financing. It can no longer raise money from the West and cannot trade in its new debt on our markets or European markets either. Starting tomorrow and continuing in the days ahead, we'll also impose sanctions on Russia's elites and their family members. They share in the corrupt gains of the Kremlin policies and should share in the pain as well.
The United Kingdom was also very quick to enact sanctions. The British Foreign Secretary says Putin has not conducted a full-scale invasion yet, but the government is ready to ramp up its response if that happens.
He has essentially violated Ukrainian sovereignty. That is why we have put together a strong response with our international allies, with the G7, to target key oligarchs close to Putin, to target banks, to put in territorial sanctions against those breakaway regions, as well as targeting those in the Russian parliament who voted for those regions to be recognized.
Ukraine's leader has welcomed the support.
I am also glad that the partners show that there is no alternative and to bring the introduction of sanctions.
But if the aim is to punish Moscow, many observers say the current measures won't really do it. Analysts point out that banking sanctions do not hurt Putin personally, and that the UK has only targeted 3 oligarchs who the US had already sanctioned since 2018. Russia's foreign minister says the Kremlin is not concerned.
Our European, American and British colleagues will not stop and will not calm down until they have exhausted all their possibilities for the so-called punishment of Russia. They are already threatening us with all manner of sanctions, or as they say now, the mother of all sanctions. Well, we're used to it. We know that sanctions will be imposed anyway, in any case, with or without reason.
Now let's take a quick look at some other places where sanctions have been used. North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country on the planet. The population is starving and its leadership is undeterred from carrying out missile tests. However, harsh sanctions imposed during the Trump administration arguably brought Kim Jong-un briefly to the negotiating table. The U.S. imposed an embargo on communist Cuba during the Cold War and still restricts economic ties with the island to this day. Venezuela's government also has its U.S. assets frozen and is largely blocked from U.S. financial markets. Iran has been under some form of sanctions since the U.S. embassy was stormed in 1979. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal offered relief in exchange for an end to the country's nuclear program, but Washington reimposed harsh measures when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. After Mali's military seized power in a coup last year, the bloc of its West African neighbors imposed a trade embargo and sealed the borders. It had a crippling economic impact. Mali defaulted on its debt, and the leadership has been forced to agree to a 5-year democratic transition. But Russia is a very different case and may be much better placed to withstand economic pressure from the West. Geographically, Russia is the largest political entity in the world by far, accounting for more than 10% of the world's landmass. It has shores on the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean and stretches the whole length of the Arctic Ocean. It has land borders with 14 countries. It has access to a dozen seas, including the Caspian, Black, and Baltic. It is arguably one of the world's richest nations in natural resources, with massive reserves of natural gas, coal, and timber, as well as huge deposits of metal and minerals. Now, some have warned that imposing sanctions could backfire with unintended consequences, including making the cost of gas far more expensive in Europe or possibly pushing Russia further into China and Iran's embrace. To discuss all this and more, I'm joined by political analyst Alexander Titov. He is a lecturer of Russian foreign policy and history at Queen's University, Belfast. Ben Aris joins us from Berlin. He is the editor-in-chief at BNE IntelliNews. And in Moscow, we have Sergey Markov, a professor in political science faculty at Moscow State Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today on this episode of The Newsmakers. We are here to discuss whether or not sanctions are an effective measure to counter Russia in eastern Ukraine. Sergey, I would like to begin with you. How concerned are you about the sanctions that have been imposed by the West on your country?
These sanctions are absolutely expected. These sanctions, it's not because Russia doing or not doing something. It's sanctioned because Russia exists as independent country, independent on United States of America, of course. So we expect that this sanction will be for sure anyway, doesn't matter what our behavior. As to about Ukraine, we protecting people in Donbass from being killing by Kiev repressive regime every day. And we're ready to protect people in Ukraine who are suffering from the repressive regime in Kiev, who are imposing political repression and kills thousands of people, torture, secret prisoners, falsify elections, and so on. The repressiveness of the Kiev regime is absolutely a clear fact for everybody who pay attention to what happens there. And we are very surprised how people who talking that they have democratic values can support such clear undemocratic repressive regime which in power in Kiev right now.
Okay, Sergey, as I understand, you disagree these sanctions are going to be helpful in de-escalating tension in eastern Ukraine. Alexander, let me come to you. Now, over the past 3 months, the West has issued many warnings of sanctions, imposing sanctions on Russia if it invades Ukraine. As per some analysts, the invasion has already happened. So certainly those threats did not work in containing Russia.
No, and I think they were not we expected to completely contain Russia, because if it was decided to do something serious. But I just want to take another point just by the previous speaker, whether the sanctions would have been imposed regardless of what Russia do. I'm not sure that's actually the case. And even if you look at the most important sanctions, the suspension of the certification of the Nord Stream gas pipeline, it's true that it's been a lot of pressure from the United States, regardless of Ukrainian crisis, to stop that constructions, but it proceeded, and nonetheless, and Germany was sticking with it. What precipitated the suspension was, of course, Russian actions in East Ukraine. So yeah, of course, sanctions are important, and they are harmful to the Russian economy. There's absolutely no question about it. Whether they are stopping to Russia escalating? No, I don't think so. And but at the same time, the most important sanctions still have not been imposed.
Okay.
But so far, the sign is that they don't really care about them yet.
Okay, so sanctions are important, but you're not sure whether or not they're going to help in de-escalating tensions in eastern Ukraine. Ben, let me come to you. Do you think it was wise of the West to introduce this idea of imposing sanctions on Russia when some had already warned that sanctions might not work against Russia?
The West doesn't really have much choice. I mean, they have very few tools available in order to make a difference, to change Putin's way. And it depends a bit which goal you want with the sanctions, what they're for. I mean, sanctions are normally imposed as a way of forcing a government like Putin's to change its ways. And from that point of view, these sanctions are ineffective. I mean, Putin has been preparing for this for, to my reckoning, 14 years. And that what he's done is built up a fiscal fortress, huge currency reserves, $638 billion, and at the same time paid down all the debt. And because of that, the West has very little leverage over Russia. And so the imposition of these sanctions are not going to force Putin to pull back from Donbass or do any of the things he's doing at the moment. Nevertheless, the sanctions come with a real cost because Putin has effectively been running an austerity budget for the last 10 years since 2012. The Russia economic growth, the potential is only 2% now. And that's way too low for a country like Russia. And moreover, it means that Russia is slowly falling behind the rest of the world, which is growing much faster. And that's the true cost of these sanctions. And in that sense, they're extremely painful. And Russia can't sustain that because eventually it just gets further and further behind. And so Putin wants to get rid of these sanctions. But in the short term, in terms of what he's doing at the moment in the Donbass, the West responded with sanctions as its only tool, but it's not going to change Putin's mind.
Okay, so as I understand, in the short run, Russia is going to feel the impact of these sanctions, but in the long run, there's a possibility for Russia to recover.
Yeah, if things calm down and Putin gets his deal and he backs off and then he starts to release some of that money. I mean, the $630 billion is equivalent to 17 months of import cover. And the economists say that you only need a minimum of 3, and in the West it's even less. If he released that money, the economy would boom. And so he's making, I mean, he's been preparing for this. He's sanction-proofed the economy, and he's going to push until he gets his deal. And if he gets his deal, then hopefully he'll back off and actually feel more relaxed. And then this fiscal fortress is no longer necessary. And then it would boom. But the alternative is a new Cold War, and then, we're back where we were, when I was a boy.
Okay, Sergey in Moscow, let me come to you. Now, certainly these sanctions do have an impact on Russia. Reports tell us that since the annexation of Crimea, which took place back in 2014, the Russian GDP per capita went down by 35%. So tell me, what is your navigation through this? Because if more and more sanctions keep on coming against Russia, the GDP per capita will keep falling even further.
It's absolutely clear that sanctions undermine Russian economy and undermine and diminish standard of living of the dozens of millions of the people. It's clear for us. It's of course it's sanctions is bad for Russia. But at the same time, I want to stress that sanctions started even before this event in Ukraine, meaning the militant coup which overthrew democratic elected president of Ukraine and imposed illegal regime there. It started before Russia support the decision of Crimea to reprisal against illegal regime which took part in Kiev, and it's also before. And we understand very well. Yes, they use sanctions. What for? What's their goal of those who organize? Is their goal to support absolute repressive regime in Kiev? Not. Their sanction is to put Russia on the knees, to strip independence of Russia, and then to divide Russia, as we believe, and then to use same repressive regime in another.
Sergey, expand on that. How do you think the West is dividing Russia? Expand on that for us.
It's very easily imposing, first of all, puppet regime in Russia, as they impose puppet regime in Kiev. And then this puppet regime will make the decision of the very deep confederation of the country. It's the plan which absolutely clear for us. Russians don't want Russia to exist. It's the choice between, it's for us. It's not yes sanction or no sanction. The choice is either we preserve our independence or sanction.
Okay. Alexander, let me come to you. What other plans do you think the West has at this point, besides imposing sanctions on Russia?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, at this point, you mean if nothing else happens in eastern Ukraine or in Ukraine in general? Well, I think that would be kind of continuing status quo, which would be very disadvantageous for Russia because it's already sanctions been imposed, but it didn't really get anything in return in terms of just controlling the territories which were already under his de facto control. If there is a further escalation, which is most likely given the speeches by Putin on Monday and other preparations, and yesterday confirming that the separatist territories are recognized in the kind of old borders, administrative borders, which means they need to be extended further on at some point. Then we see further sanctions. The problem here is that no one in the West actually wants to fight with Ukraine. So Ukraine is abandoned in terms of to Russia in military terms, and then they will just try to grind it down.
So, Alexander, if I may interject here, so are you saying that Ukraine is pretty much on its own when it comes to a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Biden says so. There's been no American soldiers. They evacuated all the embassies. They evacuated all the instructors, military instructors. Biden said repeatedly that there will be no even special services rescuing Americans because he can't risk a direct clash with the Russians. I mean, it's obvious that Ukraine is not important enough for the West to actually fight over, but important enough to impose sanctions over on Russia for it. So it will be, if it comes to the worst and there will be full invasion, there'll be this long-term grinding down Russia with the economic sanctions. But if you look at all other countries, I mean, it's never changed anybody's behavior like Iran or North Korea or anything like that. So very unfortunate there.
Okay. Now, Ben, let me come to you. Certainly, sanctions did not work against Russia back in 2014. They did not work. Yes, they did hurt the Russian economy, but it fell short of stopping Russia in eastern Ukraine. Tell me, what other options do you think the West has at this point? Do you think countries like the United States and NATO would be willing to go beyond imposing sanctions on Russia?
That would mean war. That would mean fighting. The only other alternative, apart from sanctions, that I can see that the West can possibly do to make any difference in this fight is to arm Ukraine, to send pour weapons into Ukraine and to give it a fighting chance, because the Russian military machine is far superior to the Ukrainians. That if war starts, then the first thing the Russians will do will fire with their vastly superior air force over Ukraine and take out Ukraine's air force, and that will happen within 2 days. And then the infantry on the ground in Ukraine would then be exposed to bombs, rockets, attacks from the air, and they would have no way of defending about that. And so one thing the West can do is give, and it's been doing it, it's been delivering significant amounts of Javelin missiles, and now they're talking about Stingers, and these are all sort of ground-to-air weapons. However, beyond that, I don't see what they can do. As I said before, I think Putin's been preparing for this very carefully, and NATO's in a position where it's explicitly and clearly and repeatedly said it will not put any troops in, because then you get drawn very quickly.
So Ben, when you say Putin has been preparing for this very carefully for some time now, do you think, would you consider whatever is happening right now a failure of the West?
No, I mean, if you look at the way this has played out, it's gone in stages, and we just entered the third one. It began with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issuing demand list, 15.8 in December. And then that kicked off a round of diplomacy in January that started with the Americans looking for a no NATO guarantee. That failed. And then in the beginning of February, there was a European round that kicked off with Macron, and that was looking to implement the Minsk II peace deal, which would bring the end to fighting in the Donbass, but has a de facto built-in this autonomy.
Ben, if I may interject here, to what extent do you think President Putin was
guarantee.
interested in implementing the Minsk agreement? Because some say he's the one who effectively killed
Absolutely.
the Minsk agreement by recognizing the so-called Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk.
He absolutely wanted to see it implemented, and he lent on Schulz and Macron to sell that to Zelensky. And the reason we've gone to the third round now is, like last week, at the end of last week, Zelensky made it perfectly clear that he was not willing to do that deal. Because, as I say, built into the Minsk agreement is the autonomy of the Donbass, which de facto gives Russia, which controls the Donbass, a veto over NATO, over Ukraine's vote to join NATO. And that's what Putin's after. But he saw last week when Zelensky made it crystal clear Minsk II was not going through. So then he abandoned it. You know, that road is now closed. And we're into the more darker, scarier version, whereby effectively what he's threatening is either Ukraine declares neutrality, it becomes a neutral country with no aspiration to NATO, or you fight a war with us. I mean, the possibility of escalation of military violence now is really present, and that's what's just changed in the last few days.
Okay, Sergey, let me come to you. More and more sanctions are being announced by the West. Just recently, the Russian defense minister was sanctioned by the European Union. Tell me, what is Russia's plan, both in the short run and the long run? Do you think Russia has alternatives at this point?
Of course, Russia has alternatives. Of course, no one Russian government, if Russian independent country, could allow to develop the anti-Russia, which is making by United States of America from Ukraine by force, by methods of propaganda and terror, clear political terror inside country. And no one in Russia or leaders of Russia want to enjoy this and to agree with this. But how to resist? One of the possibility is just waiting. It was Putin's strategy before. Just waiting and waiting. When this Kiev regime will collapse because it's hated by majority of the nation and so on. But it doesn't work. And now it looks like another strategy would be taken. It's this regime of anti-Russia, which is created by force by United States, and it should be crushed by military force, of course, with big support of the people in Ukraine.
But that's what you're saying is about Ukraine. I'm asking you about what's Russia's plan in the long run and the short term.
In the long run, it's very easily. Russia wants to be in security, and also Russia wants to build a relationship, strategic alliance with European Union countries, which is mostly close to us, and we believe that there are some possibility of this. And also we want to build a good relationship with China and also technological alliance with China. It's developing and preserving own independence and own identity and playing a positive role in the concert of the countries in the world. It's very clear.
Okay, Sergey, let me ask you one more question here then. Is there any way, do you see any way for these sanctions to bring Russia, or more specifically President Putin, to a negotiating table with Ukraine?
We have no problems with Ukraine. Ukraine has no independent government. We have problems only with country which occupied Ukraine in the style is the hybrid style of the 21st century. It's United States of America. No needness to negotiate with Vladimir Zelensky, who is just puppet in the American hands.
Okay. Alexander, This is going to be my last question of the program. What do you think is likely to happen in the next few weeks? Do you see a war coming at Europe's doorsteps?
Yes. Can I just begin answering this question by saying something about what you asked Ben Aris earlier, whether the West can do anything about threatening sanctions and military supplies to Ukraine? I think it can, and that would be actually engaging earnestly in discussions about membership of Ukraine and abandoning its kind of abstract talk about that it's only up to NATO and Ukraine to decide it, but actually engaging with it. I think it's much more important to abandon this abstract principle and to prevent the war in Ukraine and having possible partitioning of Ukraine than just sticking to that very abstract principle, which will not work anyway. We know that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. Nobody wants to fight for it. So the issue here is really to go on. What was going to go further? Well, I'm afraid that the train of escalation has been set in, and that Putin has to escalate now that the sanctions have been imposed, and this will be escalating until one side is prepared to talk to the other.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Sergey Markov, Alexander Titov, Ben Aris, thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.